helping my grandpa Moyer. If I heard him cutting firewood, I would follow the sound to help load the wagon and to enjoy the tractor ride back down off the hill. Or if he asked me, I knew how to fork manure and load and unload hay wagons. And usually on one of the first days out of school for the summer, I would sit back on the sickle mower and lift the blade up at the end of the field, or if there was debris in the way. It was on many such occasions, working with my grandpa, that I got to hear him say the words, "Satan's hindering." When something would continually keep going wrong, he said it often. You know, at the time, I don't think I fully understood the meaning of that phrase, "Satan's hindering." But the older I got, the more times I experienced things constantly going wrong as well. And I would catch myself saying the same thing. Whether when the computer froze up, or the lawnmower wouldn't start, or the printing press just didn't want to run the paper that I had to run, and it would eventually end up wrapped around the ink rollers for the third time in one day, I ended up catching myself saying the same words. Satan seemed to know just how to throw a wrench into the works at a perfect time. Jesus was facing such a day in our gospel reading today. It reads, "And Jesus entered a house, and again a crowd gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able to eat. When his family heard about this, they went to take charge of him, for they said, 'He is out of his mind.' And the teachers of the law who came down from Jerusalem said that he is possessed by Beelzebub. By the prince of demons, he is driving out demons." So Jesus called them and spoke to them in parables. How can Satan drive out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, the kingdom cannot stand. Mary and Jesus' half-sisters and brothers had come to the conclusion that Jesus had lost it, that he flew the coop, that he was in la-la land. They felt that he had reached the point that he was a couple bricks short of a full load. His screws became loose, or he is out of his mind. So they figured that it was time for him to be removed and taken home. Well, Jesus had left his carpenter's business there in Nazareth, which I imagine was flourishing at least enough to make a steady living on. And only a couple weeks or months ago, he suddenly just threw the whole thing up in the air and walked away from it all. He put his hammer down and rehung his saw on the wall, and instead he started to become a circuit preacher. I mean, who in their right mind would just throw away their business, which brought in the income every week, to become a wanderer who had nowhere to lay down his head to sleep? And on top of it all, it seemed like he was on a head-on collision with the Jewish leaders of his day. No one could take on the scribes or the Pharisees or the chief priests and hope to get away with it, right? And yet here he is. Jesus, a Nazarene, a carpenter, a nobody, and he had just started a little roaming society of his own. A very strange society at that. Think about it. Who in their right mind would have a carpenter as a teacher, or a couple fishermen, a reformed tax collector, a fanatical nationalist, and a thief all as his students? And on top of all that, we're not the type of people we would think of that would be that ambitious and would know what to do in emergencies. Those religious and political leaders of the time must have been thinking, who in their right mind would pick a group of people like that to be circled around and then call them his friends? Seriously, they don't even sound like that kind of people I'd want to be around or mixed up with. A corrupt tax collector or a lawyer? Who would you want to be in business with as your partner? Maybe Jesus was looking a little messed up. He threw away his career as a carpenter, so his security was gone. He had no place to call his own, no formal residence, no safety net. And he had already begun to rock the boat with the synagogue and temple leaders. His thinking was opposite to what most people did then. Society either loved him or hated him, depending on where he stood on the social ladder. Security, safety, or social status. Jesus didn't appear to be growing in any of these categories. and he didn't seem concerned about it at all. Maybe Jesus didn't like anything being secure. His focus wasn't on himself and what was best for him, but rather his concern was always on others, those who surrounded him. His disciples and followers were a very mixed up group. Jesus' security and status relied only on focusing on one thing, on that of his and our Heavenly Father above. And now on top of all that, I imagine a tax collector like Matthew and a fanatical nationalist like Simon Peter probably went head-to-heads at times as well. But all 12 were bound together because they all had accepted Christ as their master, teacher, and Lord. Most groups today will be made up of people from different backgrounds, different careers, and different walks of life. All of them will also be holding different gifts. But you put different people together on the same team and the same goal in mind, and over time they become welded as one, as a family. They will fight against themselves, yes, but their target is always unified, working one together. It all makes me think of an old TV show called Gilligan's Island. I'm sure you've all heard of it and watched it before. The professor, the millionaire, and his wife, the actress, the skipper, and the captain, all were different, but they all still remained together with a common goal in mind, to get off the island. In the gospel, the 12 disciples remained together to reach the lost and to learn from Christ. Those who share a leader and a common faith can become friends. We can love each other and remain one when we all love and put and keep Christ first in our lives. A crowd was sitting around him, and they all told him, "Your mother and brothers are outside looking for you." And Jesus asked, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" Then he looked at those seated in a circle around him and said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." It makes me ask, who did Christ see when he looked around that circle? Most likely the 12. But his view then expanded outside that house. His view went on indefinitely. I say this because he used the words whoever. Whoever does God's will. That means if you and I are willing to obey God, to be his children, that makes Jesus our brother. All of us who believe in him are members of God's family. It may cost us everything, but we have a place saved for us. And we all belong to him. We also might want to ask ourselves, where would we be in this picture? In the gospel reading, would we be outside with Jesus' mother and the siblings and the chief priests and the teachers of all standing there to just watch what was happening? Or would we find ourselves outside listening to this man teach and heal, wanting to be inside? I ask because the only ones not within eyesight of Jesus are the ones who truly had no personal desire to get in, nor were they the ones standing outside pressing inward to hear as much of Christ as they could. Those who were standing at a distance were the ones who thought they knew what religion and family life was supposed to look like, and how it was supposed to follow their standards and their rules. Never did anyone ever love and honor their mother as much as Jesus did. But here he shows that we must put God and the cause of his kingdom first. Looking around at that circle of his disciples, he dramatically pointed to them and claimed them to be the nearest and dearest to him. They were those who did the will of God in the faith and love of their hearts. He could look upon each of them knowing what the future still held for them, whether betrayal or crucifixion while upside down, or thrown off a balcony, or executions in countries throughout Africa and the Middle East. All of them were willing to surrender it all to continue the spreading of the good news. He would reach thousands or millions through them, regardless of how Satan would hinder, just like he did their teacher. And his hindering has yet to stop. It continues on. Because I remember one morning, almost 10 years ago, it was in the winter time, and my parents had the luxury to be in Florida, where I wish I would have been with them. Well, it was a Sunday morning, and I had to preach, so I grabbed my Bible, my sermon, and my albs, and headed out the door and got into my Chevy Tracker to go off and serve. My mind was a million miles away because I must have made it 100 or so miles down the road before it occurred to me something was wrong. I had a bad vibration, and the tracker was pretty much leaning towards one corner. Sure enough, Satan was hindering. I had a flat tire. And looking at my watch, my thoughts were suddenly, why now? And as I turned around and headed back up towards the house, there was not enough time to change the tires. So as I pondered, now what do I do? And I saw my dad's pickup truck sitting there and that we used to get firewood with. It's not the prettiest vehicle in the world to drive off to church in, but it will still work, and the inspection was still good on it. So I quickly switched the vehicles and grabbed the keys and tried to start the truck, but I heard nothing but a click, 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 click. I then hit the steering wheel with the palm of my hand, and I was in a total frustration and said, why now? Why me? And I just shook my head. I then jumped back out of the truck and started to head back over to the tracker when Derek, our neighbor, hollered, what's wrong? And I quickly told him all about it and where I was heading to get the tracker and the jumper cables. So he popped the hood of the truck until I got back with everything, and he hooked up the cables, and I said a quick prayer, and suddenly got the trucks turned over. So I got back out of the truck, and my neighbor already had the cables off, and I quickly said thank you and asked him to say a prayer. That I was heading off to Verdilla to fill in for a pastor at a church there, and he quickly said good luck, and that he would have taken me if the truck would not have started. Satan hindered me that morning, but the Lord won off and won out, because the rest became history, because 2 weeks later I learned why the pastor asked me to preach there, to fill in for her. She was planning to retire in a couple months, and she wanted me to take over at the church. And the rest became history. Mary said, Jesus, is out of his mind. I imagine a lot of people said that about Christ at the time. Some days Satan does hinder. He did Jesus, he did the disciples, and he still hinders us today at times. The thing to remember is that God lets nothing happen that he doesn't have a plan for. We learn and grow from each dilemma that we face, and each one helps us to walk closer with the Lord. And in the end, someone from the dilemma walks out a better person from it all. No matter what we face, let us always remember God is in control, regardless how much Satan is hindering. God is always the one that is in total control. He is always walking beside us. And as that poem about the footprints in the sand, a lot of times he carries us through the valleys that we face. And when we look back, we realize how close of a friend we have that gave his all for each of us. Amen.